Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Tentacom video, we're going to be discussing a recent interview with Mark Cerny. We're going to be discussing the PlayStation 4's memory layout. We have a little bit of information regarding that, as well as a rather short interview regarding Blacklight Retribution on the PlayStation 4, where they've been discussing the PS4's architecture just a smidgen. So this is kind of a catch-all video because these news pieces aren't exactly huge by themselves, but I figure it's good just to throw them all together for you guys. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware, of course, I'm sorry guys, I just caught the mic there. I'm sure many of you are aware of the basic layout of the PlayStation 4. It does, of course, feature an x86-64 processor, which is a SoC, which is an amalgamation, of a CPU and a GPU. As well as, of course, 8 GB of GDDR5 memory. Now, what we do know about this memory is that it's actually divided into 16 modules of 512 megabytes, and that's surrounding the CPU on both sides of the motherboard. So obviously, those memory modules are in fairly abundant supply, and they're very similar to the memory modules, of course, that are utilized in a lot of high-end graphics cards. Further, in addition to this as well, Mark Cerny has said, and I quote, that short-term we expect some very good games. Long-term, we can look forward to the growth in the games. There's a lot of untapped depth within the hardware. He also added that the thought was that we can start with a more open process, a more collaborative look at what worked and what didn't. I did something that would have been unthinkable in 2004. I went to about 30 games teams and about what they would like to see in the next generation of hardware. End quote. So of course the PlayStation 4 is doing fairly well right now. There are a couple of games that have somewhat failed to impress. One of the more obvious ones is probably Call of Duty Ghosts. It's been a fair letdown on the Xbox One as well. There are reports that the PlayStation 4 version isn't quite hitting the frame rates at 1080p, and if you're a PC gamer, then you're probably going to be fairly intimately aware that there are some key features missing. So I suppose you could really say that the COD doesn't really count, but for a lot of titles they're doing fairly well. But right now developers aren't that familiar with the hardware. They are learning, but it's pretty much like going into something blind. You kind of put the first generation together and then you use that as a learning process. The developers will no doubt be tearing it down. They'll be doing post-mortems of their own software and they'll say, okay, here's what we learned. We used this trick to get us out of trouble on our first generation of games, but we definitely need to improve this rendering technique because it's costing us a lot of GPU resources. Or maybe they'll say, you know what, we definitely need to improve our utilization of GPU compute, GPU, general purpose computing on the graphics card. Basically, GPU stands for graphical processing unit. And obviously with the PS4's structure is very much designed just to take advantage of that. I have no doubt that the developers are going to get much more out of both systems. I mean, the first 1 to 2 generation of games are not going to be indicative of what we're going to be seeing, 3 to 4 years down the line. It's just a fairly obvious observation maybe, but it's been pretty synonymous. I mean, I remember, and this is going back a few years, but I remember the Sega Saturn, and the Saturn struggled like hell on 3D games with some pretty basic stuff. I believe gorge shading was one of them, and there was a couple of other bits, basically a lot of transparency. And developers, in the early days, they just said, quite simply put, it couldn't be done. And yet, developers eventually found ways around this and they managed to get the games working really well. And the Saturn's architecture was actually a bugger. It was really difficult to utilize properly because it actually had twin CPUs and twin video processing units. And so developers really needed to kind of push that, and what a lot of developers were doing, but they were just actually utilizing one CPU with the Saturn, which isn't really good. It's pretty much like saying, well, I only need, to ride a bicycle with one wheel, because the second wheel's not really that important. It doesn't do much for stability or anything like that. In other words, of course, they are really hampering the performance. And this is maybe an extreme example for the PlayStation 4, because the PS4 is definitely a more open architecture. We know that the Xbox One is having some issues resolving around the ESRAM. The ESRAM, of course, is the very small amount of memory that is pretty damn important for the Xbox One's performance. But the PS4 is not perfect, as I've said several times over. Although it has an abundant amount of memory, it is not a limitless pit. And you've got to remember that if you're talking about high definition graphics now, I mean, if you're talking about like ridiculously powerful systems, then obviously you still have to compare it to like a PC. For example, the released GTX 780 Ti has a rather whopping 48 ROPS, 240 texture units, 2,880 stream processor units, and tons of memory, 384-bit memory bus width with 7 GHz effective GDDR5 memory. My point being that the PlayStation 4, of course, doesn't have, they can't charge like $500. This is like one of the highest end graphics cards available for the PC. And of course, there are more comparative graphics cards for the PC, but my point being that the PlayStation 4 had finite budgets they had to deal with, and so there are limitations on the hardware. But as developers become more intimate and more familiar with the hardware, as the tools improve, then I am completely agreeing with Cerny that, of course, we're going to be seeing much more in-depth titles. We're going to be seeing much better AI as well. No doubt, as they start to learn, okay, this is when we've got 3 processing frames on the graphics system, this is what we can do. This is, maybe we can run some AI subroutines on that. Maybe they'll get a kind of a 50-50 situation where sometimes they'll run it maybe on another thread on the CPU, and that's another problem. The Call of Duty developers, to be fair to them, Mark Rubin was discussing that one of the problems was because the hardware was changing over time, not necessarily the specifications, but the actual way that the software was interacting. It's like they weren't really sure, well, how much power do we have to work with? And so they would allocate certain amounts of memory for a certain task, but they were kind of guessing at some points. Because even Sony at some points didn't really know where they were going with this. It's just kind of how hardware evolves over time. You have to make kind of educated guesses at some points. Anyway, let's move on to the Blacklight interview. Zombie Studios are, of course, the developers of a Blacklight Retribution, and it's actually been confirmed currently. I'll read you guys out the quote. We are currently at 1080p, and as the game evolves, we are targeting the highest frame rate possible. So obviously that's not a confirmation of 60 frames per second, but I guess we're just going to have to continue. It's also said that any gamer knows that PC gamers and console gamers are different, but what really brings them together is the mutual love for awesome games. It's exciting to bring Blacklight to the PlayStation 4, where a new audience will get to see it, and existing fans can enjoy the game they already know and love. I think many of you are going to be wondering how it compares to a high-end PC. And Jared, who is being interviewed, says we have all of the PC settings cranked up to the highest settings on the PlayStation 4, so it holds up great. We're really happy with how the transition between the high-end PC and the PlayStation 4 works for us. When questioned regarding the PS4's GPU versus the Xbox One, and Jared said we spoke with both Xbox and PlayStation. Our decision is something that we cannot talk about, but we're really happy to join with the PlayStation group with Blacklight. As for the Xbox One technology, we cannot speak about that because we currently have no Xbox One projects underway. So there you have it, guys, a couple of interesting news pieces all thrown together lovingly into one video for your audible consumption. As some of you may be aware, I've been somewhat less active the last last week, I'd to be honest with you, because of obviously one of the big projects that we've been working on, the frame rate analysis, has just gone up. And to be honest with you, I've been really sweating it the last month or two, getting all of the data and testing out all the different programs and goodness knows what else we've needed. So I've kind of just been relaxed in the last couple of days, but I'll be back to full production swing tomorrow, which is Friday, and I've got some bits and bobs planned. I know a lot of you have been posting links and stuff on Facebook, and I've not actually been clicking on them for the most part, because I know if I did that, I would start to cover lots of stuff, and I kind of mentally needed a bit of a breather. So hopefully you guys understand that. I'm sure you do anyway. But as I said, tomorrow onwards I'll be back into it. I have some plans to cover some really big pieces of news and some tech stuff as well. And look out for a special project, hopefully up by this weekend, although it's going to be somewhat gargantuan, so it might slip a day or two. But regardless, I'm going to try it. Well, I'm going to try our utmost to get it up and running. Regardless, I will bid you farewell. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.